Remember this?
Even if things did go wrong, let's just assume that things went wrong.
Yeah.
But the worst case scenario, economically, is better than where we are today.
And what about this?
We can give people cheaper food, cheaper bras, cheaper shoes. It's a massive opportunity.
So you say.
So Nigel says, and a handful of economists, including Patrick Mimford. Remember this?
Is it not conceivable that what you're really talking about is essentially the collapse of the entire UK car industry? That when we leave the European Customs Union and go directly into competition with Asian car manufacturers, this transitional arrangements is just a polite way of describing the wiping out of the manufacturing industry. And how's that going to be explained to a public and a political class that are increasingly proud about the development of this kind of manufacturing industry in Britain?
Well, I think that it's perfectly true that if you remove protection of the sort that has been given in particular to the car industry and to other manufacturing industries inside the protective wall, you have got you're going to have a change in the situation facing that industry, and you are going to have to run it down, and it will be in your interest to do it just in the same way that we ran down the coal industry and the steel industry. These things happen.
So based on John Oliver's amazing episode where he brought in 96 climate scientists versus 3 deniers, I'm going to bring you a whole host of economists saying how shit Brexit is, just to prove once and for all it is complete shit, it'll never work, and Nigel Farage is being promoted by the media saying it can.
So it's rare, Danny, I think it's fair to say, isn't it, that economists reach consensus on some issues. There seems to be a consensus that there's a growth issue in the UK. But how much consensus is there among economists that Brexit is to blame for the UK's growth problem?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, Emily Maitlis talked about this some time ago. I mean, at the time of when the debate was on about Brexit, there were thousands and thousands of economists who basically said the same thing as I've just said. And I think there were probably 5 who got onto every TV program, essentially saying, if you like, just equivalent that the world was flat. And so basically the consensus before it happened was the same. The consensus now is the same. The only issue is how disastrous is it? I mean, the question you have to ask, if anybody thinks Brexit was a great idea, what's the explanation of why the UK is basically the sick man of Europe, the sick man of the OECD? And what explains that? There's a simple explanation, which is investments falling in the UK, mobile workers that were here, greasing the wheels of the labour market have left. And essentially, we saw data today saying the export performance of the UK was completely disastrous, and also worst of in the Western world. So I don't really know what anyone's arguing about. I mean, you can do the King Canute thing, saying hold back the tide, but I mean the jury came back. The fat lady started singing. There is no debate anymore. It's an unmitigated disaster, and you can't eat sovereignty. I mean, that's as simple as it is.
So how does the UK fit into this picture? Well, to start with, the UK remains something of an economic laggard. It's the only economy not to have recovered its pre-pandemic level by the second quarter of this year. And we think the UK will face a moderate but relatively persistent recession over the coming 2 years. On the external side, the picture also remains relatively difficult. Currently, total UK trade remains 25 to 30% off its pre-Brexit trend.
It is a negative supply shock in that you are ruining your competitiveness specifically with your largest trading partner. It is a fact of life. It's one of the few things in economics we can talk about as a fact of life, that gravity applies. What is gravity? You trade far, far more with the countries you are contiguous with and the countries that you historically have interacted with than with countries that are far away. That is true for the US in the context of NAFTA. That is true for the UK. No matter how much there's been a special relationship, no matter how much the UK tries to be a global exporter, the fact is you've got more than twice as much trade with the EU, more than twice as much investment with the EU as you do with the US, or let alone the rest of the world. As David Cameron pointed out when Prime Minister while I was at the Bank of England, the UK does more trade with Ireland than they do with the BRIC countries combined, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. So this is negative, full stop. Additionally, because the UK had this special status as the less regulated, less low-tax, English-speaking, rule of law place, not that all of that was in question elsewhere in the EU, and certainly Ireland was similar, but had this special place, and people liked living in London, you had a huge amount of investment in the UK as a platform to enter the EU because you were part of the EU deal. That goes away. It may not go to zero. It will gradually come down. I see a representative, for example, of Toyota Motor Corporation here. Toyota, Nissan, Ford all have disproportionate amounts of their European auto production in the UK. All have indicated that they will not expand those production, will probably decline those production points in the UK when the UK loses full market access.
Please do me a big favor and hit that like and subscribe button.
It's undeniable now that we're seeing much bigger slowdown in trade in the UK compared to the rest of the world. That's showing up despite the statistics having been much worse than they used to be. There being a discontinuity, but people have tried to do various ways of trying to correct for those things. There's also the services export side, which we don't have very much contaminated statistics for, so I can say that much more confidently, that there again we're seeing a really strong stagnation. So we're definitely performing below trend in terms of the exports numbers, in terms of the imports, even probably a bit bigger than that. Yep. My own work shows that the simple way of thinking about what Brexit's done to the economy is that in the period that happened after the referendum, there was the very sort of powerful, the biggest depreciation that any of the world's 4 major economies have seen overnight, that contributed to increasing prices, reduced wages, and I'm not talking simply through real wages, but also through nominal wages. We think that number is about 2.6% below the trend that real wages would have been on. After that came, sort of soon afterwards and before the TCA happened, came the effects from the uncertainty that was unleashed, which basically translates into reduced business investment. I'm less certain of the FDI effects. Those tend to be very lumpy things. Then what's happening now, we're starting to now see the trade numbers react to the Brexit, the actual TCA impact. And that's what I mentioned in the beginning, that we're definitely underperforming compared to our peers, both in terms of what we're sending to the EU, as well as in terms of what we're sending to the rest of the world. Okay.
I'd like to add on to this, because I look at a lot of firm level data, and the small firms are the ones that are most damaged. Yep. Because the cost of the paperwork and so forth is a barrier. It's not just small firms in the UK who want to export, but it is also small firms in Europe. Yep. Who were suppliers and provided competition. Yep. In the UK market.
Well, Brexit is and was and will be a total disaster for the main reason that we already have low investment in this country. We have a financialized form of capitalism. We have lots of companies making money not because they're investing in the productive infrastructure, but just because they're buying and selling, assets. So how do you actually foster long-term growth? You need productive investment. And when businesses see the market actually reducing, the market that they can actually service reducing, which did reduce with Brexit, they invest less. And there's been a massive flight of business investment away from the UK, also research investment away from the UK. Research is a key driver of long-term growth.
Consensus among economists that the Theresa May's deal will make us significantly poorer compared to staying in, but equally, no deal would make us even poorer.
So basically you're saying any option other than, in economic terms, you think any option other than remaining is bad?
Well, actually, the proposal which some people have been talking about, Norway Plus, where we stay in the single market and the customs union. Now, there are all sorts of complications with that politically, but from an economic point of view, if we actually stayed in the single market like Norway does and had a customs union on top of that, actually the differences between that and remain from an economic perspective would be pretty small.
But in terms of Brexit, it is absolutely clear if you look at investment or if you look at trade, that has had a substantially negative effect on the UK economy relative to other economies, and that is part of the problem that the Chancellor needs to deal with.
Is it the case, as Simon picked up, and it seemed to me, that the middle class is actually going to be hit by all of this because of these tax thresholds being frozen? Is that what's going to happen? Well,
everyone's being hit at the moment, and we're seeing possibly a almost record reduction in real household income
Record.
over this year. I mean, certainly if you look at the current projections, what's happening to real household disposable income in the next year or two, that's falling, because obviously wages are rising, but they're not rising as fast as prices, and at the same time taxes are rising. So all of that's hitting households, and with the freezing of tax allowances and further tax rises, yes, I mean, the Chancellor couldn't have been clearer. Everyone's going to be hit by this.
Well, you mentioned Brexit. London's lost its crown to Paris as the biggest stock market in Europe. Is the City of London permanently damaged by Brexit?
You know, I would cast the net wider than that. The UK economy as a whole has been permanently damaged by Brexit. It's reduced the economy's potential output significantly, eroded business investment. I mean, look, if we hadn't had Brexit, we probably wouldn't be talking about an austerity budget this week. The need for tax rises, spending cuts, wouldn't be there if Brexit hadn't reduced the economy's potential output so much.
What's certain is the economy is not going to do very well for a very long time. But what the price of Brexit is like throwing sand in the engine of your car. What is certain is this doesn't have to cause a massive recession, but it will cause the economy to have a lower rate of productivity growth for a significantly long time.
Well, clearly, any deals that it can do with the rest of the world will help. But let's keep this in perspective. The best deal we've done so far is with Australia. That's been worth 0.08% of GDP for the UK. The cost of leaving the single market, according to the Office for Budget Responsibility, the government's own advisor, in the long term is 4% of GDP. You need an awful lot of Australia-style deals to make up for that. And frankly, those deals aren't out there to be done.
I somewhat hate to say this, but it does remind me of Brazil getting hammered by Germany in the World Cup.
Brazil are being humiliated, humbled and taken apart, and their supporters simply cannot believe what they have seen.
But instead of seeing those humble tears that we saw from some of the Brazilian players, we're seeing a doubling down, with fits of laughter in between. The score at the moment is 11-1, and we've got people still wanting to vote in Nigel and other Brexiteers that have caused this economic mess, and they're still being platformed by the media. Let me know your thoughts about all this and whether or not John Oliver had a point, and so did I today. If you'd like to help the channel, hit that like and subscribe button. And once again, I'd like to say a big thank you to all of my Patreon and YouTube supporters. You keep this channel going and growing. If you'd like to help out, there's a link in the description. Otherwise, thanks for listening. Bye for now.